So welcome everyone to this morning's session. Without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to David to introduce himself, but just by way of the briefest of explanations, David is someone who has had much success recently with speaking to people and getting them to think differently. So he's well placed to show us the way from here. Over to you, David.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So yes, my name is David Charles-Lambus. I've got extensive history in the consulting world, lots of background in psychology. And I found something very interesting 18 months ago at the start of the pandemic, is that I considered myself to be relatively good with debating with people, and then something strange was occurring. People were no longer listening to logic, ration, or evidence. So we felt that we needed to delve into this in much more detail. So this is what we've created with this project. We've got a number of very skilled people sharing information with us, and we've created a whole body of work. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to look into one thing that we call the high-level map. And just before we start, there's a really important fact to really acknowledge. Now, Jerome Bruner was a cognitive psychologist in the 30s and 40s, I believe. Now, he showed that when it comes to information and sharing information, if you wrapped a fact in a story, it was 22 times more powerful. Now, this is quite incredible. Now, there's some researchers that will actually question this, and they say, oh, it's only 6 or 7 times more powerful. Just think about how logical that is. So it's only 600 or 700% more powerful. So yes. So what is the project about? It's for people wishing to challenge an idea, a belief, or a narrative with someone who is not. So we use the example of Jane Bloggs commonly, and she wishes to talk to her brother, Joe Bloggs. But Joe Bloggs is being very resistant to new ideas. So the project is about Jane acquiring the skills, the knowledge, and the right mindset in order to question Joe and question these ideas without triggering him into a sort of fight or flight state. Now, what we found is that each person has much more than enough resources to learn everything about the project. And as Max Planck famously quoted, science moves on one funeral at a time. Now, what Max was referring to is that even quantum physicists will be very unaware of their own resistance to new ideas. Once we have an established idea in our mind, it becomes real and truthful, and challenging that becomes very problematic. So Jane will have her ideas and her beliefs, as will Joe, and then they will often have different conclusions, and that is when the fun begins. So what the project is, it's a study of how to navigate a person's resistance and conditioning to have an open, honest, and two-way exchange of ideas and information. It's effectively the conditions for truth to arise. And as you probably realize, a lot of the conditions in conversations at the moment is quite the opposite. What it is not is tools and techniques to get someone to see things our way. If that is a perspective, that becomes problematic. And it's not to manipulate or coerce anyone, because pretty much everyone's had enough of that. We're all well aware of how the propaganda is coercing people. So in conclusion, the truth is compelling enough that it stands on its own merits. We just have to point to it effectively. So just some notes about today's presentation. We're going to focus on one aspect of the project, and that's the high-level map. And that effectively is mapping out what is someone's resistance. So what we'd say is that if I want to reach a person, I'm going to cross the minefield of their resistance. And if I can navigate all that resistance to reach the rational part of them, then I can have a good conversation. There is a course developed, and it's being uploaded currently onto the site on all the other areas of the project. But effectively, the high-level map is going to be the biggest bang for the buck. It's going to be the sort of tips of the iceberg around the really key points. So I think what's really key, firstly, is just a little bit of acknowledgement. Let's just take a moment, have a nice deep breath. We are by far living in the most intense times. So we really need to take a moment to appreciate the fact that we're still here and functioning as best as we can. Okay, the conditions for that not occurring is huge. And I don't think we give ourselves enough credit that we're still functioning and we're still doing things, we're still getting out there and speaking up. Many of us have been ridiculed, laughed at, and even abused constantly. And this always happened through history when you challenge established ideas. And here's a really key point. What we're going to suggest in how we need to take the sort of higher path is in some respects unfair. So if Jane and Joe wish to have a conversation, Joe is not going to want to go out of his way to accommodate Jane's knowledge or understanding. Jane, on the other hand, however, feeling that she has a higher awareness, is going to have to make allowances for what's going on in Joe's mind. This is unfair, but on the opposite side, it gives us a lot of control, and it starts to bring the power back to us to say, okay, Joe has believed certain things that we believe not to be true. He's very resistant. How do I reach him? And this is, I think, a very sort of powerful quote. So the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wise are people so full of doubts. We think about a lot of the politicians, they stand up there as though it's 100% truth, very, very forceful. And those that are really questioning things. So, I mean, every now and then, you know, I'll wake up and I'll be full of doubt. And then I just sit down, work through it, think, okay, you know, and be very clear. So it's a perfectly human reaction. And I think this perfectionist approach that we've all suffered from just gets in the way. So here's the question, how did we get here? So I think it's fair in saying that 2 + 2 = 5 for a lot of the people. So in a town far, far away, the leader declared that 2 + 2 = 5. They started teaching this in schools. Experts came out to back this up. The media started reporting daily on 2 + 2 = 5. And then someone says, hang on a minute, 2 + 2 = 4. And this angered everyone. Anti-5, stop spreading misinformation, stop spreading dangerous info. So this is where we are. And we've got here, effectively, I'm just going to touch on this because we've got some videos in more depth, but some of you will be familiar with the Mind Space document and the 7 laws of influence, all these kind of things. So there is a behavioral insights team that resides in Whitehall. It's a team of psychologists, and they work out how to design public policy in the fact that people, to coerce people to follow it. And we have a number of factors here over a couple of slides, and I'll just touch on one, for instance. You'll see commonly this messenger principle that's commonly used. So it'll always be expert so-and-so says this, Dr. so-and-so says that. So people really respond to people in power, and it's very persuasive. And there was, in fact, one very powerful study in the US where they questioned a set of nurses, and they said, would you administer this cocktail of drugs to a patient? 80% of them said no, because it's potentially lethal. They then ran a separate study where they had an actor phone up nurses pretending to be a doctor, asking them to administer that same cocktail. 95% of them went to do so, which is really incredible. When we look at how the authority principle really allows for many policies to move from top all the way down to the bottom. And understanding this one thing really makes sense in how so much policy has been enacted without people questioning it. Yeah, so people think there's checks and balances, and the authority principle really overrides that. So there's a lot of these factors, and getting familiar with them becomes very useful, particularly when it comes to messaging, and also for understanding the messaging that we're receiving and obviously debunking it. So getting the most out of the high-level map. So effectively, we want to spot loads of things that we're not doing well, because then that gives us, okay, if I'm not doing that well, then this is great because I have something I can do better. If we're doing everything perfectly, then that's not good news because things aren't working and we don't know why. The more we're flexible in approach, the quicker we get good at reaching people. And of course, the high-level map is describing the minefield of resistance in each person's mind. So let's take a look at the high-level map. So we've effectively categorized it into 333. So there's 3 things that we identify as bombs. These are things that we mustn't do. If we do these, then the conversation moves to an argument and we both become, or at least one of us becomes very emotional. There's hurdles. There's three things that we have to overcome, and they're very key. And if we don't overcome them, then we're going to have trouble reaching someone. And then there's three things, which are the green boxes. And these are the things that we want to do. And these are the things we've identified as being very powerful in reaching people. So these are our things. We're going to plot these on kind of a snakes and ladders board now. But first, let's take a quick look at what we mean by the bombs. So effectively, the bombs are going to evoke fight, flight, or freeze. Now, I'm sure all of us here on more than one occasion has seen this. We'll be having a conversation and all of a sudden someone goes into a very argumentative state. And it's almost like they turn into a gorilla. Okay, so everything's going, and often, sometimes we don't know what's done it. Suddenly we see this wild animal. And that's when someone goes into this fight or flight. So what happens when we hit a bomb? So effectively what will happen is the heart rate will increase, the blood will go to the extremities, blood pressure will increase. So the body is getting ready to fight or flight, or just sometimes now when it happens so often is just to freeze. Now what's really, really important is that move into the emotional part of the brain. This can be physical or mental perceived threat. And the absolute essential part of this is the rational mind shuts down. If I had £1 for every time someone said to me, I know exactly what I wanted to say, but then I got angry or emotional and I couldn't remember a single thing. And they think that's specific to them, but that's specific to all of us. The minute we go into the emotional brain, the rational brain shuts down and it's impossible to think of anything. So it's absolutely key that ourselves, we avoid this, and we also navigate the other person so we don't trigger them into this. And of course, that's easier said than done. If one person triggers, there's an increased likelihood of the other person joining them, okay? Because there's pretty much mirror neurons going on. But by the same token, and it's really metaphysically putting our hands up for a fight, but if we can hold the space and not go into the fight or flight, then the mirror neurons will send back calmness to the other person and they will come back relatively quickly. I've had this experience where I've been getting used to people coming up and screaming at me if I'm on any of the marches. And in a short space of time, we can get them back into a rational conversation. If we don't follow certain patterns, we just end up having an argument. So it's very, very key to understand these. So if you hit a bomb, acknowledge it to yourself, be calm, stop for a moment, and then reconnect. And what will happen is the more and more you see what triggering the bombs, you just won't tread on them. So it's come to the point now that I very rarely tread on the bomb because I'm really mapping out in people what are the common things that trigger them. So here is our high level map. Now we've got mindset here, but we're not going to touch that today because that's quite an in-depth part of the course. But let's assume that Jane is taking care of her mindset. She's in a relatively good state of mind. She's now going to want to reach Joe, and she's going to have to traverse this snakes and ladders board. So I'm quickly going to introduce the 9 subjects. Then we're going to look into them one by one. So don't worry too much if they don't make sense on this slide. So we've got the perceived threat that we have to overcome. Then we've got what we call opposition. And this is to do with dynamics. It's very, very key. Then we've got the fact that we need to connect on common ground. Then we've got another bomb that's termed reactance. We've got this moral versus authority question that's very key. We have inertia. Then we have cognitive dissonance, but I'm sure we've all seen many times. Questions, metaphors, and stories. And then perceived effort. So this is really a simple way of showing the tips of the iceberg. And you'll see there's 3 red, 3 yellow, and 3 green. So let's take a look at the first level. Now, just to introduce this concept, on any of the 9 that we're going to look at, for today's purposes in the limited time, we're going to look at really just the tip of the iceberg. And there's certain subjects you won't need to do a deep dive because you'll know enough about that subject to get the solution that you want. Some of the subjects you will want to do a deep dive because there's a lot of data under the surface that'll be very useful. So first of all, perceived threat. So when someone perceives us as a threat to them, foe rather than friend, and it's just very context dependent, they will trigger into the emotional part of the brain. So if you were just to walk up to someone in a park and sort of walked at them in a very angry way, they would, get ready to respond. We become emotional when faced with a perceived threat. So it really is this is metaphysically putting our hands up for a fight. And mirror neurons will often fire, so both people go into this state. And it's into the complete argument. So the first thing that we really want to do whenever we approach someone is just really have a very soft approach so they know that we're not a threat to them. Okay, and it's really is the first trigger. So if you imagine, if we took two ends of the spectrum, so you've got someone standing there with a big board that says, everything's a hoax, and at the other end you've got someone, wearing 3 masks and loads of gloves on. The sight of each other is literally going to trigger each person. They don't even need to say a word. That makes sense. So it's very much the approach. Now, what I've experienced myself is that, if I see the person I want to speak with as an opposition or as a perceived threat, I will approach him that way. So the first thing I have to do is actually soften up and really get beyond my own anger and bitterness, which, is not easy. But once we do that, then we soften and the person will soften also. So then we have the first hurdle that we come up against. Now, this is one of the most important things, even though it's not a bomb. If we want to reach someone, this is one of the biggest oppositions that we face. Now, what we mean by opposition is effectively the divide and conquer. So what you'll have is that people will see themselves on opposite sides of the debate. Now, when you think about a public political debate, how often have we seen, say, Conservatives and Labour, them in a public debate where someone will say, actually, the other guy's correct? Anyone remember a time like that? It never happens. It never happens because they perceived each other to be in opposition. The reason that this is very key is that group formation and orientation. So what we mean is that through history, we've evolved to go into groups and communities. Now, if a community sees another community as in opposition, studies have shown that they won't listen to anything they have to say. So this is what happens, that you build. So we've probably seen a lot of echo chambers going on, and that's what's happening. Is that once groups have been formed and defined, and if another group has been formed and defined and is been shown as in orientation as opposition, they won't listen to each other. In fact, they will go out their way to oppose each other. Now, we've all had that experience where you may say 5 things, 4 of them may be 100% solid and factual, and then one of them's got a little bit of wiggle room. If the person zones in on that 5th one, that's a sign that they're in opposition to you. Okay, if you're not in opposition to them, they won't zero on in that. They would have a sort of balanced approach. So the propaganda seeks to isolate those it wishes to silence as in a minority, an undesirable group, such as conspiracy theorists or anti-vax. That's the whole point of these groups. They define the group, they give it a space, they paint it in a really bad light, and then anyone that they want to silence, they place in that group. That makes sense. So it's effectively a role that we play. This is why when you're speaking to people, they've been given a script, you'll say something, they go, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Now, what happens is it's really been defined as 2 groups now. You either agree with the party line or you're a conspiracy theorist. Now, that's obviously quite ludicrous. So it's very key to not step into those boxes. And it's very straightforward once you know what someone's doing to actually step out of those boxes. But another thing is we need to be careful of how and which information we show. So I was talking to a political scientist from Spain the other day, and he brought up a really good term, which is caricature. And really what it is when you're speaking to someone, they have a caricature in their mind of what you're like if you're questioning the narrative. Okay. And what happens is that caricature in their mind drives all their behaviors and how they see you. And it's so important that the first thing that we have to do is reverse that picture. Okay. And it's really not possible to reach anyone with information effectively if we don't overcome this. So I'll give you an example. I was in Kingston when we visited a vaccination center, and there was 3 teenagers that had been vaccinated. And one of the ladies wasn't too gentle in telling them certain facts. 30 minutes later, their father turns up. As you can imagine, he's pretty animated and pretty charged, but also quite a polite gentleman. Now, we started having a conversation, and he started with the usual stuff. Oh, you're spreading misinformation, you're anti-vaxxers, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, stop for a moment, Dave. I said, look, let's have a good conversation here. I said, I'll be very respectful to you. I know you'll do the same, but let me point out one thing. We're on the same side. And he was sort of taken aback, and he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're here because you care for your family and your community. I'm here because I care for my family and community. So effectively on the same side, we just want to chat about the ideas. What happened then is he has to remove that caricature, because the caricature says anti-vaxxers don't care about people, they're ruthless and etc. And that's, if he has that in his mind, that's how he's going to behave. So that's the first stage. And every time I've noticed coming over opposition, people just soften and then they become very friendly. Because in fact, if they see you as opposition, they act as though you're a perceived threat, and then they're going to be very sort of rude to you a lot of the time. Really at deeper levels, there's so much going on here. I don't have enough time to even touch on it today, but at deeper levels, what the propaganda is doing is it's the manipulation of personal and group identities. Now, these are the governing forces of people's beliefs, habits, and behaviors. So just as a quick example, if somebody adopts a religion or being part of a group that's very powerful in terms of its presence, the person will usually adopt the belief system of the group, and it will override their personal belief system. This is why the propaganda seeks to get loads of the influencers to publicly declare things, because a group authority will override a personal authority a lot of the time. That makes sense, but we can't get into detail, but this is very, very key. And what they're doing constantly with the propaganda is they're defining groups, and they're defining the group's identities. Okay, so once we've overcome the opposition, and now the person doesn't see us as a perceived threat, because in fact, we're both humans, we both may have just different ideas, but we're on the same side, you're going to see some things change. Now, once we've established this common group and the common thinking, as it were, the same side thinking to really reach someone effectively. Now, what we did an interview on a document that we described the do's and don'ts in conversation. So I'm not going to go into that detail here because it's all recorded, but there's lots of the do's and don'ts in that document that show you that will really connect you with someone during a conversation. There's just lots of real things like just honoring the other person's experience. Nothing will trigger someone quicker than not honoring their experience. For example, if someone's very scared, we don't have to acknowledge that what they're scared of is not really a big threat, because they are scared. So we just really need to acknowledge that they're scared. And once we do that, then the person will be very open and warm. Now, some of you have seen Rainer Formish's interview with the psychologist from Belgium, and he did a really good thing on showing mass formation and group formation. Now, there's a free-floating anxiety that's been very present in society. Now, that's driving much of the public's compliance, because they think that that anxiety is going to be resolved with COVID, but it was there prior to COVID. So connection is very key, because this really will lower the anxiety. Now, one thing that's really essential is a genuine smile should not be underestimated. People are so lacking in seeing smiles. It's so essential. And think about it. So much of the public have been walking around in masks. And when you smile at someone, there's mirror neurons. There's so many chemicals that are going off in the brain that, and I've noticed this when I walk my dog, I'm just always smiling at the other dog owner, and we never get into any problems. Well, when I didn't do that, the dogs would have to orientate themselves. The people, oh, is this person, friendly or not? So yeah, a smile is very, very powerful. So now let's look at level 2. So we've touched on the first level and how key that is. And now we look at level 2. We're going to look at inertia, this question, and reactance. So reactance, what is this? It's relatively straightforward. And reactance describes the natural resistance to change. Okay. Anyone had the experience of a pushy sales assistant? You go into a shop and and you want what they want to sell you, but they're too pushy. What happens? We push against it, okay? Because this is the natural reactance to resist people trying to change us. Now, if we think about how when we're in that sort of state where you must listen to this, you've got to read this, you've got to see this, that's going to be too much of a push onto that person, and they're just going to push back against you, even if they agree with what you're saying. Okay, it's effectively cutting off the nose to spite the face. And reactance in terms of its bomb is literally that person will shut down. Don't send me anything. I don't want to talk to you. Stay away from me. That is what's triggering that reactance. They don't have a space from which to move into. It's been my experience that when we don't do this, we sort of pull back slightly and just show people stuff. They have a space to move into. It's really the way to describe this. It's the evangelical approach. It will trigger reactance. When someone's standing on the street corner shouting, you need to listen to this, their audience is generally 0. Because it's that feeling, oh, they're pushing information onto me. They're trying to make me believe something. So then we've got this one. I'm only going to touch on this because this effectively is so huge. And it's really, we either outsource our decision to the authorities or not. We cannot do both. Okay. So someone either has to take ownership of their own decision or not. So what I'll do a lot of the time, and it's really this nanny state thinking. So I'll be constantly asking someone a question. Well, it's important we ask questions, isn't it? Is it important you make decisions for your family? And what I'm doing effectively, I'm pulling them back into that rational part of the brain that they start taking responsibility. Okay, because if they don't start thinking consciously, then they just go into autopilot. And when people do acknowledge they are key in the decision, we're going to see people taking more responsibility. It's very much a state of mind. And what it does also, it very softens people, because a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, just follow the science, just do this, just do as you're told. And then you can just gently ask, if the policy, you know, if it turned out the policy caused more harm than good, would you still follow it? Now you see the conundrum of that question, because it automatically pulls them back into the morality of things. Morality always supersedes authority, but if we don't become aware of it, then we're, you know, it's not activated. So then we have the next hurdle, which is inertia. Now these are forces in narratives, momentums, and behaviors. And it's a bit like, do not push against trees. Okay, how many times do you see people trying to, you know, take on an argument that's just not winnable at that time? Okay, for instance, there's certain people that are trying to challenge, you know, if we talk about the COVID jab, yeah, that's a very specific thing that I think we have a lot of justification to challenge. But challenging, you know, vaccines in general, that is a very big tree that's not worth taking on. And it's not really one that you want to do at the moment, regardless of what your beliefs are, even if you want to start having that open conversation. This is why they've used the term vaccine very specifically, because they're using the tree and all the sales and the marketing and the inertias of decades gone by. That makes sense? So effectively, it's very powerful to just separate the two out and then just challenge one. To be aware of currents of narratives, to know which one can be diverted. So effectively, what we say is do not swim upstream. So do not swim directly against the narrative, but you can start to question it. And there's certain narratives that, you know, the media will start reporting on things, and then it becomes quite easy to question something, but don't question it until, you know, the inertia is there, that we, you know, not too strong. So then we get on to level 3. Okay, so then we've got the cognitive dissonance, the questions, the metaphors and the stories, and the perceived effort. So cognitive dissonance. So what is it? So effectively, cognitive dissonance is, cognitive refers to, you know, brain processes, and the dissonance is really two things that don't match. So it can be a belief in an idea, two ideas, etc. And when these two form the same sort of space, then there's this dissonance. And what happens is that, funny enough, with cognitive dissonance, the reason it's a bomb, the fMRI studies show that someone hits dissonance, often they go into the emotional part of the brain. So if we look at the mask example, prior to the mandates, hardly anyone wore a mask. It was almost sort of zero, wasn't it? The minute the mask mandates come in, people started wearing them. And what's fascinating from a lot of the research in the cognitive dissonance, if you can get someone via laws or any other means to do a certain behavior, then they're going to experience dissonance. So they don't believe that the mask is going to be effective, but they've had to wear it. What will happen is that creates dissonance. This will create a real discomfort in the person. Then they're left with that they really want to resolve dissonance, and they're always trying to resolve dissonance. So what happens is they change their belief system. Oh, the mask must do something, otherwise they wouldn't make us wear them. So then they start defending the mask, and then they start having a go at anyone that's not wearing them, because their belief system now backs the mask. Now, if you challenge that directly, you're going to see an animal, as we all have seen. Now, the change in the belief system is largely outside of someone's conscious awareness. It's something that we gradually do. I mean, I know I've experienced this. If we bought something, an item or a car, and it turns out to be a lemon, we then try to justify it to ourselves that it's not as bad as we thought. That makes sense, because we want to make ourselves feel better. So the Milgram experiment is very fascinating. It touches on a couple of things. It touches on the authority aspect, and that Stanley Milgram ran experiments to determine how persuasive just the fact that someone was an authority was. Prior to the studies, psychologists had estimated that about 1 in 40 people would press a button to administer electric shock if told to do so by authority. As it turned out, that 65% of people did. So the study is that the person is sitting in a chair and they've got buttons in front of them to administer electric shocks. There's a person on the other side of the screen who's actually an actor and he's not connected, but he's going to make the responses though he are. And then a person in a white coat instructs the person to press the button. Now, what happened was that when the electric shocks start getting quite high and the actor starts screaming, the person in the chair started to experience a lot of physical discomfort. Now, and a lot of emotional discomfort, and that was actually what's known as morality dissonance. Now, what happened was that the person is now in a really uncomfortable position. They're asked to administer the shock, but they don't want to, so they're experiencing this dissonance. Then the authority said, you must do it. The way that the person resolved the dissonance is they said to the authority, will you take responsibility? Once the authority did, the person then pressed the button. Now, what's fascinating about this is it really shows how so much of the control is held together by the authority principle. And if once enough people know about it, then they can then get back into the morality and it will start to take a lot of this away. But what was very interesting about subsequent studies is that when the person pressing the button didn't think that the person on the other side of the screen was just another member of the public, if they saw them as an enemy, they stopped experiencing the stress. This is why they're painting out the conspiracy theorists and the anti-vaxxers to be such bad people. You will then see that the general public will not care what happens to them. They will even start saying, oh, they shouldn't get medical treatment. Oh, and there was even comments, I'll just run them over. This is why, because this caricature in people's heads of how they see someone is very key. Once we know about that, we can start to reverse it. Now, this will often trigger when people provide conclusions. This is really, really key. If I had this happen to me even last week, even though I know about it. So I came out after one of the calls and I'm walking on the street and I bump into a friend of mine. This friend relays to me how he's on a weight loss program and how he's following calories in, calories out. I know from various research that's very ineffective. So I proceeded to tell him and give him a conclusion. And then I saw a lot of resistance because that's what he was doing, all his behavior. So suddenly a little wild animal come, and it was only a little one because he's a friendly guy. And then I realized my error, took a moment, calmed down, carried on. And then I started to relay a story about Timothy Ferriss and about the book that he had written and about all these studies. And I told him a few stories, effectively told him the same thing. And he went, oh, wow, that's amazing. I really want to look into that. It sounds so much easier. Here's the thing. If we provide a conclusion that differs from the person's current conclusion, that creates cognitive dissonance because that makes things very uncomfortable. We don't like our beliefs being challenged because our beliefs are a survival. So if I was to sum this up, do not tell someone the punchline of a joke without telling them the body of a joke. In a sense, it's very, very key. And I think this is one of the most common things that we're seeing is that people are just trying to give everyone else conclusions. And since they believe different items at the moment, it just triggers cognitive dissonance. And then they start defending their position. So effectively, don't tell them 5, show them 2 + 2. Makes sense in reference to what we were talking about earlier. So here's the question, how do we do that? So now we come on to, I think, 2 of the most important things that are at our disposal. And the first one is questions. So good questions inform, great questions transform. So learning to artfully, skillfully ask questions that gently guide the other's focus. That's what it does. When you ask a question, it will take that person to a destination in their mind. Okay, and questions can bring ideas into focus, and they will often elicit cognitive dissonance. But there are times when we want to do this gently. So if we do it really artfully, where we ask a series of questions, the person will just stand there and go, oh, hang on a minute, I need to think about this. Give them the space. They've hit dissonance. They've hit dissonance in their own mind, and they've now realized that they've got 2 things that don't match. That's a really good place to be. Now, if you've got connection, you're on the same side, the dissonance is not going to be that bad for them. If you're in opposition and you hit dissonance, you're going to see a wild animal, and they're going to start screaming at you, particularly on social media. Now, there is a lot more on questions, but we don't have the time to go into it today. But we've got some there's even books on how to ask a question, and there's certain models about there's only 10 questions really that you can ask, and it's very fascinating, but it becomes very, very useful. So now we get on to the stories and metaphors. Those who tell the stories rule society. That was Plato. This is known for thousands of years. This is why very wealthy people have bought up all the media. It is the most important, powerful aspect of getting people to believe things. So stories deliver facts in a very, very effective way. As we saw that quote earlier, from anywhere from 600% to 2000% more effective. I've often asked people, just throw 12 facts at people and see how many land. Hardly any will land. You'll tell them a very good story and there'll be fact after fact after fact that will really land in that person's mind. We are literally wired for story. Linda Cron, a brain researcher, has done a wonderful TED talk on this, which we've got access to a link on the website. And she shows how it really shocked her how effective she was by stories without realizing. So people were really unaware of the importance and often dismiss the power of stories. But this is what's driving the whole narrative, is the stories that they've told people and the stories that then people are telling themselves. If we can tell them slightly different stories and stories with facts in there, then they're going to shift, because it's these stories that we tell ourselves and how we see ourselves that drives our behavior and our beliefs. So we literally think through metaphor. Now I'll give a quick example here. So we've got a number of metaphors within the project, which we've kind of designed and used to have people change their behavior simply. So one thing we noticed during conversations, a lot of people would talk about subjects that were far beyond the other person's comprehension. And what would happen is the person would just call them a conspiracy theorist. So we designed the Hotel of Knowledge to effectively say, all of us with our knowledge, if you imagine all the things that we believe are like pillars, and then we build a conclusion. And after a few years and many investigations on certain subjects, we build what we can call a Hotel of Knowledge. Now, if you're talking to someone that just believes the general narrative, if you try to talk to them from the 5th floor when they've not walked in the door, nothing's going to get through. So we designed this metaphor, we used it, and now most people just start on the ground floor when they're talking to people. They don't talk about these advanced subjects because they realize it just triggers people. So stories and metaphor effectively code our reality. So when someone reads a story, they're then making sense of the world through that story. So the final one is actually what we call perceived effort. Now, this is actually very key for pretty much our lives, in that if we perceive something to be very difficult, then we usually get distracted and we'll do something else. Once we do get someone's attention and we've reached them, then it's very key that we want to, if it's too much effort, they're going to shy away. And it's really linked to overwhelm so often, that we want to package information in simple, short, and easily digestible formats. And we can manage this to a degree that they can absorb. If somebody suddenly wants to ask questions and then we send them a 100-page medical study, you're not going to see a lot of response. That makes sense. They're really at that soft point where they want to know. So we've designed a website where we've taken lots of the complex subjects and put them into 1 or 2 pages. Now, there's so much scope for some really good documents and pieces of information and stories that can really resonate with people. So we're going to stop there. Currently, the Zoom presentations on the course are free, and we'd like to keep it that way. We may do nominal fees for certain workshops, but we want to get this information out to everyone as widely as possible. If you have benefited and would like to donate, then please visit this link at reachingpeople.website /donation. For videos and information, visit reachingpeople.website or info@reachingpeople.website. Thank you.